This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices and influential thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm Joel Anand, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardorj, economist, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. This weekend, we are pleased to have Ambassador Terry Miller join us on America's Roundtable. Ambassador Miller is a director of the Center for International Trade and Economics and the Mark A. Colantronis Fellow in Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. In this position, Ambassador Miller directs the center's ongoing research into the role of free markets and international trade in fostering economic growth around the world. The center's signature publication in this area is the annual Index of Economic Freedom, a country-by-country guide co-published with the Wall Street Journal. Prior to joining Heritage in October 2007, Ambassador Miller had a distinguished career as a diplomat and public servant. In 2006, he was appointed ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Global Issues. Ambassador Miller, we extend to you a warm welcome.
It's my pleasure to be with you today.
Welcome, Ambassador Miller.
How are you, Natasha?
Great.
For over a decade, the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation have tracked the march of economic freedom around the world through the important research, the Index of Economic Freedom. According to the Heritage Foundation, the index has brought Adam Smith's theories about liberty, prosperity, and economic freedom to life by creating 10 benchmarks that gauge the economic success of 185 countries around the world. Ambassador Miller, could you kindly elaborate on your findings published in the 2013 Index of Economic Freedom and perhaps begin with how America fared in this year's report?
Well, America didn't fare very well, Joel. America ranked 10th this year. That's the same ranking as in previous years, but the U.S. score declined again, and that's the 5th consecutive year that the U.S. score has declined. Only Ireland and Equatorial Guinea have also had scores declining 5 years in a row. The U.S. is now the second freest country in North America behind Canada. The reasons for the decline are pretty clear in the United States. It's the excessive government spending, the high tax rates that have just been increased yet again, regulatory overload, and overall an erosion of the rule of law. These new tax increases we've just seen are likely to drop the U.S. out of the top 10 altogether next year.
What do you think? What kind of policies would restore America's place among the world's freest economies?
I would start with the tax system. The U.S. has one of the most cumbersome, complicated tax systems in the world. It's an extremely progressive system in terms of having a wide variety of rates. The corporate tax rate is the highest among developing countries right now. So we really need to get the tax side of things under control. Our system provides some terrible disincentives to people, particularly poorer people, in terms of having them want to work and realize the gains from work. So that's one area to start. Then we've got the regulatory problems, things like the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory bill and the recent Obamacare health bill. These are extremely complex legislative vehicles that are now being implemented through hundreds of different kinds of regulations. And what we're finding out is something that I think people that believe in free markets always knew, which is when you have very complex kinds of economic activities, it's really very difficult for governments as a single entity to regulate them efficiently. They just don't have the knowledge of everything that's going on in an economy to be good and effective, efficient actors. It's much more efficient to let the economic market, the free market, disperse that decision-making process out through individuals throughout the economy, empowering people to decide for themselves what they want to do in these areas.
In fact, as you've mentioned, Ambassador Miller, about tax rates, it's also interesting for our listeners to realize that The 35% corporate tax rate in the U.S. is the highest among the world's developed economies. And as a nation, we missed an opportunity to address the cutting of the corporate tax rate during the recent fiscal cliff negotiations. And when we look at the corporate tax rate from a global view, it's important for our listeners to understand what's happening, say, on the other side of the pond. In Sweden, this is what the Prime Minister had to say when talking about the corporate tax rate. He says, "This is the most harmful tax of all." And this is a statement that he delivered at a press conference. And Sweden had a tax rate of 27%. It's bringing it down to 22%. And they're aiming to bring it down to 15%. But it's also important for us to all remember that the EU average is 23.5. So you are indeed right about how we are not competitive as we once used to.
That's right. We have a globalized economy now, and the United States has to compete with other countries as the location for new investment and new business ventures. When you have this disparity in corporate tax rates, well, it certainly can be an important factor in where businesses choose to locate and where they're going to create jobs and grow employment and grow economic activity.
One of the largest drop, as we look at the indices and all categories, one of the largest drop was in the area of government spending, where the states dropped from 2001, where there was 71 point, to 47.8, actually, which was repressed category at this stage. At the same time, corruption deteriorated and also lost some 7 points. You mentioned in the index that there is a trend with cronyism that erodes the rule of law. How can we go against that? How can we improve on this course?
Well, you know, a lot of people have the idea that governments represent the interests of the common people in society. But what we find when we look around the world, including in the United States, is that when governments intervene, it's almost always on behalf of interests that are already rich and powerful in society. That is, government represents those who are already the haves in an economy, not the have-nots. Sometimes they pay lip service or have small programs that try to be advantageous for the poor, but in reality what they're doing is representing the status quo, those who already have power and wealth in society. This is where cronyism comes in, where governments act on behalf of those who have special interest or special influence. In other words, the friends of the government, the friends of the powerful. This is terribly corrosive, not only of economic efficiency, but also of the moral fiber and legitimacy of government in a society. So we think it's one of the most important factors. And in fact, this year in the index, we have a special section of chapters that focuses just specifically on the rule of law, with factors like corruption, property rights, cronyism.
In your commentary published in the Wall Street Journal titled "In the Index of Economic Freedom, Liberalization Slips," and Ambassador Miller, you explain that what happens in Washington affects not only every corner of America, but of the world. And I'd like just to take a moment to read an excerpt from this very important op-ed piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal earlier this month. And it states, I quote, "It is no exaggeration to blame the recent slowdown in economic liberalization around the world on the lack of U.S. leadership. Trade flows, the engine of world growth, have declined as the U.S. economy has stagnated. Protectionism threatens consumers and businesses with higher costs and restrictions in supply." And at times when we tend to focus on a variety of issues, very little space in the media is dedicated to the significance of trade. And Ambassador Miller, how can the U.S. show trade leadership? And are there examples that we ought to examine and certainly advance in the days and months to come?
Sure, Joel. I think one of the big problems is that the global push for trade liberalization has really stopped. We had amazing progress when we had the Uruguay round, the creation of the WTO. There was really wonderful progress, and I think this improve the integration of the world economies with one another, and probably is the the single most important factor in the huge burst of prosperity, not only in the developed countries of Europe, the United States, and Asia, but in the poorer countries, the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and really throughout the world. What we've seen is some tremendous progress historically over the last 3 or 4 decades in improving trade flows, improving the process of globalization. That really appears to be coming to an end, and this global push has degenerated into a kind of regionalism and bilateralism. In the United States, we had 3 free trade agreements adopted during the first 4 years of the presidency of Barack Obama. All of them were negotiated under his predecessor, George Bush, and it took a very long time to have them approved and implemented. And there's very little in the pipeline right now. There's talk about a kind of free trade area between the United States and some of the countries bordering the Pacific Ocean in South America and in the Pacific. That's a good idea. There's been a little bit of talk of a free trade area between the United States and the European Union. Well, maybe that's a good idea too, but what we really need is for countries to recognize that you get the benefits of the trade, of increased trade, when you lower your own barriers. So we could have both unilateral action and a recognition that if all the countries of the world get together and lower these protectionist barriers at the same time, you're going to have tremendous bursts of investment, of financial flows, of flows of goods and services. There are going to be more jobs for everybody, and the overall level of prosperity is going to increase.
Based on the current developments and since the latest results of the index, and in the meantime, the taxes increase, postpone spending cuts, and also increase the debt limit, where do you see America heading in the 2014 Index of Economic Freedom?
Yeah, I think America is almost certain to drop further. It's hard to see what kinds of changes are possible in Washington right now that would actually increase economic freedom. Probably the best we can hope for is try to slow the drop and the loss of economic freedom in America over the next year. One other factor about the U.S. that I want to particularly emphasize is something you just alluded to, and that's the problem of U.S. government debt. And that's not a problem just for the United States, but that's a problem for the world, because this massive U.S. debt is soaking up international investment capital from all over the world. What's happening is that places like China that have surpluses of capital are using that capital by buying U.S. government bonds. So in effect, they're financing U.S. government activities rather than having that money go into the private sector where it could really create jobs and increase the prosperity for people everywhere. So I think the debt is really, we all know about the debt problems that are affecting the European countries right now. Hopefully they're starting to get some of that under control, but the U.S. amount of U.S. debt dwarfs debt in Europe, and I think is really a significant problem, not only for the U.S., but for the world overall.
Indeed.
Yes. Could you share with our listeners about the most free countries in the world and the overall trends with the Index of Economic Freedom when it comes to the world and the 10 categories?
Right. Well, the freest countries in the world, interestingly, 4 of the top countries are in the Asia-Pacific region. Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand are really at the top of the list. Number 5, and the only other country we consider fully economically free, is Switzerland in Europe. Every region has a country that performs pretty well. However, you've got Chile in Latin America, you've got Canada leading the North America region, you've got Bahrain in the Middle East that has a good score, you've got Mauritius in sub-Saharan Africa. So we do find that the benefits of economic freedom are achievable under any kind of cultural setting and also any kind of geographical or resource setting. You take a country like Switzerland, for example, that has very little in the way of endowment of natural resources, unless you consider mountains and snow a resource, and I suppose we might, but otherwise it's not as if they have oil or natural resources or anything like that. And in fact, one of the things we found in our study of rule of law is that resource endowments like oil can actually be a problem for development because they encourage corruption unless you have a very strong property rights regime in place. And I really wanted to say just a word about the value of all this, because it's not just an abstract thing, economic freedom. The reason we think this is so important is that there's really massive evidence from around the world that people with more economic freedom enjoy better lives. They live longer, they have better health care, they do a much better job in terms of protecting the environment. Societies that are economically free do a much better job in reducing poverty. Economic freedom, the free market system, it's not a system that's just good for the rich. Yes, it is good for the rich, but it's especially good for the poor because it disperses economic power and it provides opportunities for those that don't already have them.
Indeed. In fact, those are very important aspects of the importance and significance of economic freedom, as you have shared, Ambassador Miller. And as we look at the Asia-Pacific region, which certainly includes some of the world's most dynamic economies with what we would consider emerging economic giants of China and India, when looking at India, the world's largest democracy, are a bit surprised by the fact that the nation is ranked 119th in the world and remains unfree. Now, how can nations like India, or perhaps other countries in Asia or in other parts of the world, move higher in the rankings found in the Index of Economic Freedom?
Yeah, I think India is one of the real tragedies of the last several decades. Yes, they have made progress, but it's far below what the potential of that society should be. India was one of the countries that was most committed to socialism, to the socialist form of organization, after they achieved independence from Great Britain. And they really never went through a revolutionary process to get over that, in the same way that the countries of Eastern Europe, for example, went through a revolutionary process in the 1990s to rid themselves as much as possible of their socialist economic legacy. We haven't seen that in India. There's been a little progress, but India has very cumbersome regulations. It has very poor financial systems to provide capital for potential entrepreneurs. They've been able to progress based on globalization, free trade in other countries, but they've kept their own economy protectionist, so their citizens haven't benefited so much.
Indeed, for those of our listeners who are interested to learning more about the Index of Economic Freedom, we would encourage them to visit heritage.org/index. And the Heritage Foundation's website offers an interactive edition of the index rankings and scores, and it allows individual users to explore the data and to share it with others through social media. So we would like to encourage our listeners to visit heritage.org/index to learn more about the Index of Economic Freedom and to be able to review some of these very important chapters written by Ambassador Terry Miller and his colleagues at the Heritage Foundation and the think tanks that have, some of the think tank leaders that have contributed to some of the chapters included in this study here.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Miller.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you the very best in your important endeavors, and we'll certainly continue to encourage our listeners to focus on the importance and the benefits of economic freedom.
Thanks a lot.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.